right, so part 3 of the blood vessels lecture is pretty short, just wrapping up with what can control blood pressure. So blood pressure is also known as your mean arterial pressure, MAP, and MAP is determined by 3 factors: the heart rate, your stroke volume, and your total peripheral resistance. So these 3. So it's a multiplicative effect. And you can see from what variables go into it, it's based on both your heart. So your heart rate and your stroke volume is primarily your heart, right? And then your total peripheral resistance is primarily your blood vessels. Of course, stroke volume also has to do with venous return. And so that is a little bit of both. It's the heart and also the blood vessels working together. But let's look at this. So cardiac output is controlled by changes in stroke volume and in the heart rate. You can change the preload, right, by filling the heart and by changing venous return. And we saw that we can change the amount coming back to the heart by increasing the venomotor tone, and we can do it by increasing things like the fluid in the blood, the amount of fluid. So hormones and the nervous system can work together to mediate your blood pressure, both by the heart itself and by the blood vessels. Blood vessels also afterload. Remember afterload, the amount of pressure that the heart has to generate in order to open up the aortic valve. And that afterload is going to depend on the resistance, because if you have a high resistance in your blood vessels, then it's going to push back on the afterload. So let's take a look at what factors control your mean arterial pressure, and this is letter B. In general, your blood pressure is regulated by the heart and your vessels, and there's 2 controls. The short-term control is neural. It's by your nervous system. The long-term control of blood pressure is by your hormones. So mainly. So let's look at neural control. So how does your nervous system know what your blood pressure is? So there are high pressure receptors and there are low pressure receptors. Receptors, right, in different areas of your body. So pressure receptors are found in the aortic arch and the carotid sinuses. And remember, pressure receptors are called baroreceptors. So baroreceptors are present in the aortic arch itself, and then in these areas called carotid arteries. These are the area that's kind of rounder. Let me remove my marks here. Oops. Sorry about this, guys. Let's go back to this picture. So you see how these rounded areas of the blood vessel, those are the carotid sinuses, which is part of your internal carotid artery. Those have built in both chemoreceptors as well as baroreceptors. So baroreceptors can feel the stretch on the wall of your arteries, and they can react to that, responding to the stretch. The more stretch, the higher the blood pressure. So your nervous system can relax the smooth muscle, dilate to lower the blood pressure. The way that these work is frequency of action potentials. Very simple. So you have a baseline frequency, and then when the pressure goes up, when you have increased blood pressure, you increase the frequency of action potentials. When you have a decrease in blood pressure, you decrease the frequency of action potentials. So that's all it is. So your brain gets the feedback of the frequency of action potentials. So this is the cardiovascular center of the brainstem, the region of the brainstem called the medulla. And so let's just take a look at, this is a little bit of the sensory fibers, what we're looking at here, right? So sensory fibers, the baroreceptors in the wall of the carotid artery, the carotid sinus, and then baroreceptors in the aorta will send sensory information towards the medulla, okay? And then we have integration in the brainstem, and it can react by sending parasympathetic fibers or sympathetic fibers out, right? So remember, parasympathetic fibers can slow down your heart rate by innervating the SA node. Sympathetic fibers also can, they speed up the heart rate, but they also innervate at the SA node, but also you see how the fibers go to the myocardium, right? Then we have sympathetic fibers going to the adrenal gland, so that epinephrine and norepinephrine are in the bloodstream. When they are in circulation, they can bind to those adrenergic receptors on the blood vessels themselves, and the blood vessels can constrict, and thereby controlling your blood pressure. So your input under letter B, cardiovascular control, input is your arterial baroreceptors, as well as low pressure receptors. So low pressure receptors are actually down a little bit, letter C, but they are in your veins and your right atrium. We also have chemoreceptors. So input, so in the carotid sinus, we also have abilities to detect oxygen concentration, carbon dioxide concentration, and acid, hydrogen ion concentration. And that can also go to your brain and regulate the response there, the stress response. And the output would be either sympathetic fibers or parasympathetic fibers, depending on if you wanted to raise your blood pressure, your sympathetic fibers would be active. If you wanted to lower your blood pressure, your parasympathetic fibers would be active. All right, so let's look at something called the baroreceptor reflex. So this is a reflex that happens, it's built in to a drop in blood pressure. So the reflex itself is a sequence of events that trigger an increase of blood pressure, right? So why would you increase blood pressure? Because your blood pressure dropped. And this reflex is done when there's a drop in blood pressure from your arterial baroreceptors, which then feed back to the control center of your brain, the cardiovascular control center, and then they would signal the sympathetic fibers to increase blood pressure. So an example of this would be standing for a really long time. This is called orthostatic pressure. So these British guards, I know they have a name, I just can't think of it, but they stand all day. They stand. And if you're not moving your muscles and moving your blood around, gravity will eventually pull your blood to the bottom of your body, and it'll drop the blood pressure in the aorta and in the carotid bodies. And that's going to cause you to faint. And the blood's going to come from leave your brain, and you're going to faint. So that is called orthostatic hypotension. I guess these guys will sometimes just faint from just standing. Or another example would be you're losing a lot of blood and your blood pressure drops because of hemorrhage. In both scenarios, your blood pressure drops. So let's start at the top here. So you have a drop in mean arterial pressure. Your baroreceptors are getting fewer action potentials, right? It's saying, hey, our blood pressure is low. The brain is going to increase the sympathetic activity and decrease the parasympathetic activity. What your sympathetic fibers do is they go to the SA node to increase the rate of your heart. They go to the ventricle of the heart to increase the contractility, to make each pump of the heart much more forceful. They go to your veins to increase that tone, to decrease compliance, to increase that venous pressure. And then they go to your arterioles to constrict, to increase that pressure. So your sympathetic activity in this reflex goes to both arteries and veins. Everything tightens up, everything creates higher blood pressure. So all of these factors, an increase in heart rate, an increase in stroke volume, an increase in end diastolic volume. So remember that your venous blood comes back to the heart and it's going to fill the heart with more venous blood. So the end diastolic volume will be higher. That's going to increase your stroke volume. And then we have the total peripheral resistance is also going to go up. All of these factors will increase your blood pressure, okay? So this is not a fix. This is just a compensation, right? If you're bleeding, you're still going to be bleeding. It doesn't stop the bleeding, but it tries to fix your low blood pressure status for just, tries to reverse the course of your low blood pressure. This is just a graph, and just, it says the same things as I just said. So Here's your controlled normal situation. You're bleeding, and this is your reflex. So if you're hemorrhaging, the volume of your blood goes down, so the stroke volume goes down. Your cardiac output then goes down. Nothing happens to your resistance if you're losing blood immediately, and then your blood pressure will go down because literally you're just losing the quantity of fluid. You're losing blood, so the pressure goes down. The reflex, to compensate, right? It'll increase your heart rate. It'll increase your stroke volume. Look what happened to your cardiac output. It came up, not normal, but it came up. The resistance, because of all that vasoconstriction, right, will increase. And so your blood pressure, which was very low, starts to come up. Not normal, but it does come up. So it's a way that your body tries to fix the low blood pressure state. Other control mechanisms are hormones, which we talked about earlier. So epinephrine, vasopressin, and angiotensin. So if we look at epinephrine, it's released from the adrenal medulla in response to sympathetic activity. It increases blood pressure. So this is basically, we can look at this picture again. Let me erase my marks. Right, so this is what we're talking about now. Hormonally, your cardiovascular center can send sympathetic innervation to the adrenal gland, release the epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that can work on increasing smooth muscle vasoconstriction. It can act to increase heart rate and also to increase the stroke volume, and also increase venomotor tone. So this is arteries and veins. Vasopressin and angiotensin 2 are also powerful vasoconstrictors, and they're going to also increase blood pressure. One mention, so low pressure receptors down here. So low pressure receptors are found in your veins and on the walls of the atria. So these are low pressure vessels, right? Veins are low pressure vessels. Atria are low pressure chambers of the heart. So that's where low pressure comes from, and they can also detect pressure in their walls. And then back to the last. So other cardiovascular regulatory processes, letter A is respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is basically saying that when you're breathing in and out, it actually stimulates the opposite ends of your autonomic nervous system. So breathing in actually stimulates the sympathetic activity and increases your heart rate. Breathing out, expiration, increases parasympathetic activity and lowers your heart rate. So this has been researched, and it's this is the reason why, if you want to, so for meditation or for anxiety, if you want to calm yourself down, you want to exhale longer than the inhale. Because when you exhale, you are stimulating the parasympathetic activity. You're stimulating the vagus nerve. Ooh. I don't know what happened there. Sorry, guys, that was weird. So it stimulates the vagus nerve, and it allows your heart rate to go down. So it calms you down. The chemoreceptor reflexes are going to respond to chemicals. Okay, so you have chemoreceptors in the carotid sinus. So remember I said in the carotid sinus, you have baroreceptors and you have chemoreceptors. So they can respond to increasing levels of carbon dioxide. Increasing levels of carbon dioxide are dangerous because it causes your blood to become acidic. So you want to increase the, basically you want to get that carbon dioxide out of your body, right? So we're going to increase breathing to expel it. So we're not going to talk about respiration here specifically, but we can see that starting at the star, if you have decreased oxygen and elevated CO2 levels, this is out of whack. This is the homeostasis is disturbed, and you want to get this fixed, right? Bring it back to homeostatic. And so the chemoreceptors are going to be stimulated. So the chemoreceptors can detect this change, and they can do different things. So they can cause the blood vessels and the heart to change their behavior. And it also goes to the respiratory center so that you can increase respiration, so you can get the carbon dioxide out of your body. So chemoreceptors they respond to increased carbon dioxide levels. So an increase of CO2 will decrease the heart rate to conserve oxygen use, but it tends to let the blood pressure fall. However, it also increases your resistance. The blood vessels constrict so that the blood pressure stays the same, and you result in this higher blood pressure. And then you have, lastly, the thermoregulatory response, where if you're hot, you know this already, right? If you're hot, your blood vessels in the skin will dilate. When it dilates, it decreases resistance. And so the blood is much more easier going to go to the surface of the skin where you can lose heat. And this is going to be because of parasympathetic, right? Your parasympathetic fibers are going to relax your blood vessels. If you're cold, your sympathetic fibers will cause your blood vessels to constrict. That's going to increase resistance, and it's going to make it harder for the blood to go to the surface of your skin, so it's not, and you're going to conserve that heat. All right, and let's do some review questions. Which is not an extrinsic factor that increases mean arterial pressure? Okay, so the answer is letter B. So if you remember, this is a little detail, but you should know it. Alpha and beta adrenergic receptors will have opposite effects. Beta adrenergic receptors are found in the skeletal muscle. They are found in the heart, and they are found in the bronchioles. Okay, so you want dilation in these organs because you want more blood, more oxygen to go to these vessels. So if this choice was alpha, then it would have been fine, but beta is opposite. Which process occurs when a small group of cells are using oxygen and producing carbon dioxide faster than these gases can normally be replaced and removed at the capillaries? Okay, so the answer is they're going to dilate. Arterioles will dilate. How do arterial baroreceptors help change the mean arterial pressure? You can pause to take a look, and the answer is letter B, by sending signals to the central nervous system to change hormones and autonomic signals. Which is a response when body temperature rises above normal and thermoreceptors send a message to the hypothalamus? So if you have a rise in body temperatures, you're going to decrease the resistance to the skin. You're going to open up those blood vessels, decrease the resistance so the blood flows to the path of least resistance. When a person stands, mean arterial pressure can fall and the baroreceptor reflex is activated, which is a change associated with this reflex. Okay, so if you look at all your choices, the answer is decreased compliance to the veins.